Шановні колеги, ми продовжимо роботу.
Dear colleagues, we shall proceed with weekly updates from Principal Deputy Chief Monitor, Mr. Alexander Hook.
Good afternoon, dear friends. Since I last spoke here, we have had another week of violence, extreme volatility, and generally a failure to address the causes underlying this mayhem. Last week, the security situation in eastern Ukraine actually deteriorated. As you can see here, the number of ceasefire violations recorded by the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission more than doubled compared to the previous week. It was in fact the third most violent week we have recorded since the beginning of last year. That increased level of violence was particularly noted in terms of the recorded use of weapons proscribed by the Minsk agreements, namely tanks, mortar, artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems. As is demonstrated in this graph here, there was a 230% increase in the recorded use of proscribed weapons last week compared to the previous week. Of particular concern is the fact that embedded in that figure are no less than 400 instances when we recorded the use of multiple launch rocket systems. Again, if we go back to January 2016, this is the third highest use of MLRS that we have recorded. Now, others might draw conclusions as to what this means in terms of tactical dynamics on the ground, and indeed border strategic objectives. But one thing is clear. These weapons, particularly the older models which we tend to observe in Donbass, are less than precise, with obvious implications for the civilian population. Most of last week's recorded violence occurred in 5 defined areas. The Avdiivka-Yasinovata-Donetsk airport triangle, where a quarter of all recorded ceasefire violations happened. In the Popasna-Pervomaisk-Troitske area, where we record about 20%. In the areas east and northeast of Mariupol, where we equally recorded 20%. In areas southeast and east of Svetlodarsk, where we recorded 15%, and in the western and northern outskirts of Horlivka, where we recorded 10% of all ceasefire violations recorded. As has been the hallmark of this conflict for some time now, volatility was evident last week, no more so than in western Luhansk region. The number of ceasefire violations recorded in western Luhansk region increased by a staggering 570% compared to the week before. In terms of Minsk proscribed weapons, the SMM recorded over 1,500 explosions from mortar and artillery, including MLRS. That's about 70% of the entire total recorded in Donbass. Something similar was at play in areas east and northeast of Mariupol too. 3 mortar rounds were recorded there the previous week, but last week we recorded at least 305 mortar and artillery explosions there. Again, I leave it to others to work out the tactical and strategic implications, and especially the political implications. At the minimum, however, these figures, this violence, and in particular its ability to suddenly flare up and spread like an uncontrolled bushfire, must give us pause for thought. volatility must be addressed. The underlying causes for volatility must be tackled. Dear friends, it is patently obvious that the sites have failed to address those underlying causes. And remember, it is the responsibility of the sites to do so. They have signed on the dotted line numerous times and occasions, at every turn committing themselves to actions essential to bringing this conflict to an end. Let's look at what they have agreed to do, and importantly, what they have actually done. Firstly, they agreed to cease fire. I think from what I have outlined above, in terms of the number of ceasefire violations last week, it is clear that they have not done so. This week is no different. In so-called DPR-controlled Horlivka on Wednesday evening, for instance, our monitors in the space of 3.5 hours heard 271 explosions. Secondly, they argued and agreed to withdraw all proscribed weapons. Last week alone, now listen careful, the SMM observed 69 proscribed weapons within agreed withdrawal lines, 47 in areas not controlled by the government, and 22 in areas controlled by the government. Even worse, of weapons previously withdrawn, the SMM had been recording a steady reduction of their numbers. Storage sites have been abandoned, or fewer and fewer weapons remain. Now listen careful again. Just last week, for instance, we noted as missing for the first time 20 howitzers at the government-controlled permanent storage site and 17 tanks and 9 mortars at the so-called DPR-controlled permanent storage site. Dear friends, we in the SMM are primarily in the business of recording facts. Many of them are clearly uncomfortable for some people, so much so that they are prepared to go to extraordinary length to stop us recording these facts. Not liking the message, they attack the messenger. Friday last week, in so-called DPR-controlled Chrestatitske, so-called armed DPR members fired warning shots in the vicinity of SMM monitors. Now, listen carefully. The monitors just observed 2 self-propelled howitzers in violation of the withdrawal lines there. On the same day, in Yasinovata, one of our unmanned aerial vehicles was downed, presumably by small arms fire. The UAV just spotted the evidence of the use of large caliber artillery in the area. In total last week, the sites actually impeded our movement in one way or the other on 31 occasions, 9 times in areas controlled by the government and 22 times in areas not controlled by the government. Like with so many commitments, the sites, even though they promised, have failed to address these restrictions and attacks. There have been no actions taken to punish or hold accountable those responsible. Impunity reigns. The sites have also agreed to demine or at the minimum fence off mine-infested areas. Yet the SMM continues to see mines all along the contact line. In government-controlled Shastia, for example, the SMM observed an improvised explosive device secured with tape and barbed wire to the bottom of a traffic sign, as well as 4 anti-tank mines laid across the road. As well as having agreed to it, the sites owe it to the local communities, those most vulnerable, to failing victim to such silent, concealed danger, to immediately remove such weapons. And I go on. The sides have also agreed to disengage hardware and personnel from 3 pilot disengagement areas. We had some indication they have done so, at least in some extent, in 2 of these areas, namely Petrivske and Solote. But even in Solote, we are now recording ceasefire violations. Last week, we recorded 28 ceasefire violations inside the Solote disengagement area. Not so unexpectedly, given that the sides have failed to honor their commitment to disengage there, we recorded 119 violations within the Stanitsa Luhanska disengagement area. Dear friends, as violence rages on along the contact line, it is natural that people ask and indeed demand that it stop. Too many people are paying the price for the side's refusal to stop. Since the beginning of the year, the SMM has confirmed 86 civilian casualties, 16 of them fatalities. As the world celebrated International Women's Day this week, when the world rightly demanded we close the gender gap and recognize the contribution women make in our societies, it is worth pointing out that 28 of the civilian casualties were women. There are many rights all of us are entitled to, and many women around the world still fight to secure. But the right to life is surely paramount. So long as violence continues, so long as the root causes of violence remain unaddressed, namely the presence of weapons and the proximity of the sites, these most basic rights of all will remain conditional for all people in Donbass, not just women. Those making decisions need to prioritize the rights of individuals, especially the right to life, above all other considerations. This involves more than paying lip service to UN charters or lofty words and bouquets of flowers on International Women's Day. It requires concrete actions, namely the cessation of fire, the withdrawal of proscribed weapons and disengagement. Anything less is hypocrisy and hyperbole. Anything less is an insult to women and men who have suffered too long from this violence. As usual, at the end of my statement here, I would like to inform you about the latest mission numbers. As of today, the mission has 716 monitors, of whom 615 are deployed to the east. In addition, there are 335 Ukrainian colleagues and 92 other international staff working for the SMM. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Дякую, пане Хук. Колеги, чи є запитання? Do we have any questions? There is one.
Dear Principal Deputy Chief Monitor Alexander Hope, my name is Valery Lukov. I am journalist. My first question, please, can you comment on the following? What do you think? Is it possible to set up a general security system to secure the basic right to life, not only in Lugansk and Donetsk regions, but also in Crimea? Based on our information, do you have any representation in Crimea, in Sevastopol and Kerch and Feodosia? There is no representation of the OSCE. And I will ask the second question. Based on our information, OSCE Monitoring Mission also deals with the nuclear security situation in Central Europe. Today we have nuclear weapons in Crimea. It is placed there in Crimea by the Russian Federation, and the topical issue for today, from the OSCE perspective, is to monitor the placement of the nuclear weapons in Crimea and Ukraine. Thank you.
You are raising important questions. However, most of them are beyond the mandate that I'm representing here today. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has the task to observe and report about facts in Ukraine. At the moment, there are no monitors in Crimea. What is needed to protect the right to life in areas where we do monitor is that the sites do adhere to what they have agreed to previously. And we know they can. It is not an impossibility. Just look back to the time when they have recommitted to the ceasefire at the beginning of the school year, where overnight they have managed to control the fire, where it went down from 1,000 violations the day before to almost 0 on the day of the beginning of the school year in September.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. We don't have further questions. So at this point, the press conference is finished. Thank you for coming and looking forward to seeing you here next week.